I remember the exact moment it all fell apart. My name's Ellie, I'm 35, and honestly, I should have known better. We were sitting in the kitchen, the one place in our house that still feels like ours. It was mid-morning, sunlight spilling in through the windows, and everything about that moment seemed so ordinary. There he was, Mark, standing by the sink, rinsing out his coffee cup. His hair caught the light, and I noticed, as I often had recently, how much thinner it looked on top. It wasn't the first time I'd thought about it, but for some reason, this time the thought just spilled out of my mouth before I could stop it. "Better watch out," I said with a smirk, "or you'll be looking like Dad sooner than you think." I meant it as a joke. I mean, my dad is bald, and he's always laughed about it. It's a family thing, humor as deflection. But the second the words left my mouth, I saw the change in his expression. His jaw tightened just slightly, his shoulders stiffened, and that soft, easy smile he always wore faded into something colder, sharper. He didn't say anything at first, just finished rinsing the cup and set it down a little harder than necessary. "What's that supposed to mean?" he finally asked, his tone carefully neutral. I shrugged, pretending not to notice the shift. "Nothing, just teasing." He didn't look at me, just grabbed a dish towel to dry his hands. "Right, teasing," and that was it. He walked out of the kitchen without another word, leaving me sitting there with my coffee, the warmth of the moment completely gone. At first, I brushed it off. Mark wasn't the type to hold grudges over little things. He was steady, predictable, the kind of person who always gave me more grace than I probably deserved. But as the minutes turned into hours, and then the hours into a full day of terse, monosyllabic responses, I started to feel the weight of what I'd done. I told myself he was just being sensitive. It was just a joke, for God's sake. Everyone teases their partner, it's practically part of the job description. But as I replayed the moment in my mind, over and over, I couldn't help but feel the sting of his silence. The truth is, it wasn't really about his hair. Not entirely. It was about everything that had been building up between us for months, maybe years. The little cracks that had started to form in our marriage, the way we'd both been changing in ways that felt more like drifting apart than growing together. I'd been feeling restless lately, like my life had become this endless cycle of sameness. Wake up, work, dinner, TV, sleep, repeat. I'd been trying to ignore it, to push the feelings down and focus on the good things. But the more I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the more those feelings seemed to bubble up in unexpected ways. I guess that's why I said it. It wasn't really about him, it was about me. My own insecurities, my own fears about getting older, about losing the spark that had made us. But of course, that's not how it came across. To him, it was just another reminder that I noticed the things he probably tried so hard to ignore. By the time he finally came home that evening, I was ready for things to go back to normal. I'd spent the afternoon convincing myself that I was overthinking it, that he'd walk through the door and we'd laugh about it like we always did. But when he stepped inside, his expression was still distant, his eyes avoiding mine as he mumbled a quick, "Hey!" and headed straight for the shower. I sat on the couch, staring at the muted TV, and felt a strange mix of irritation and guilt. I wanted to call out to him to apologize, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. A part of me still believed I hadn't done anything wrong, that he was the one making this bigger than it needed to be. And yet, as I sat there in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something I didn't know how to fix. The silence stretched into the next day, and the day after that. Every conversation we had was brief and perfunctory, stripped of the warmth and playfulness that used to define our relationship. I told myself it would blow over, that he just needed time to cool off. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore the growing tension in the air. It wasn't just the silence that got to me. It was the way he seemed to retreat into himself, closing off parts of him that had always been so open to me. I started noticing little things, like how he'd stay later at work or spend more time on his phone when we were in the same room. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just about the joke. It was about all the things we'd let fester, all the little hurts and frustrations we'd swept under the rug until they became impossible to ignore. And now, here we were, two people sitting in the same house but feeling miles apart. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to say something, to reach out and pull him back toward me. But every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. I didn't know how to bridge the gap I'd created, how to make him see that I hadn't meant to hurt him, and so I did nothing. I let the silence grow, let the distance between us widen, and hoped, foolishly, desperately, that it would somehow fix itself. Days turned into a week, and the silence between us began to feel unbearable. I told myself I was giving him space, that I was respecting whatever he needed to work through, but deep down, I knew I was just avoiding him. Every moment we spent in the same room was heavy with unspoken words, and every glance I stole at him only made the guilt twist deeper in my chest. I couldn't stop replaying that morning in my head. The way his smile had vanished, how his shoulders had stiffened, the way he'd walked out without looking back. I started to notice how often I'd done that, said something offhanded, thinking it was harmless, only to see a flicker of something in his eyes before he brushed it off. Had I always been this careless? Or had he always been this patient, and I'd just never noticed? But then there was this other voice in my head, louder and angrier, that told me it wasn't fair. He was blowing this out of proportion. It was just a joke. Didn't I deserve a little grace for all the things I'd overlooked, all the ways I'd put him first over the years? I wasn't the villain here. I couldn't be. And yet, that voice didn't quiet the pit in my stomach when I watched him get up early one Saturday and head out without telling me where he was going. It didn't stop me from standing at the window, watching his car pull out of the driveway, wondering if this was how it started. This slow, quiet unraveling of everything we'd built together. I busied myself with chores that day, scrubbing the counters with a ferocity I usually reserved for arguments. I needed to feel productive, like I was doing something, even if it wasn't fixing the thing that actually mattered. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, my mind kept circling back to him. To us, I thought about the early days when everything felt easy. When we'd stay up late talking about nothing and everything, when we'd laugh until our sides hurt, when he'd look at me like I was the most important person in the world. I thought about how I'd started taking those moments for granted, assuming they'd always be there. By the time he came home, it was late afternoon, and I was sitting on the couch pretending to read a book. He walked in quietly, set his keys on the counter, and disappeared into the bedroom without a word. I told myself I didn't care, that I wasn't going to be the one to break the silence, but the lump in my throat said otherwise. That night, as we lay in bed with our backs to each other, I felt the weight of the distance between us more acutely than ever. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a chasm that I didn't know how to cross. I wanted to roll over to touch his arm, to say something, anything, but I stayed frozen, paralyzed by my own pride and fear. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I cornered him in the kitchen as he was making his coffee, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Can we talk?" He looked at me, his expression guarded, and for a moment I thought he might say no. But then he sighed and set his mug down, crossing his arms as he leaned against the counter. "What do you want to talk about?" he asked, his tone even but distant. I hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. I hadn't planned this out, hadn't rehearsed my words. All I knew was that I couldn't let this go on any longer. "About us," I said finally. "About what's been going on." He raised an eyebrow. "What's been going on?" His question caught me off guard, and I felt a flicker of irritation rise in my chest. "You've been distant," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Ever since that morning, I feel like you've been shutting me out." Mark's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "Ellie, do you even know why I'm upset?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Did I know why? I thought I did. It was the comment about his hairline, wasn't it? Or maybe it was how I said it. "You're mad because of what I said," I ventured. "Because of the joke." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "It's not just the joke, Ellie. It's what the joke represents. Do you know how many times you've done this, made some comment like that and brushed it off as teasing? Do you even realize how it makes me feel?" I stared at him, stunned. "It wasn't meant to hurt you," I said weakly. "It was just, I don't know, a stupid joke. But it did hurt," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's not about your intent, Ellie. It's about how it landed. And the worst part is you don't even seem to care. You're so quick to defend yourself, to justify it, but you never stop to think about what it's like on the other side." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't speak. All the defenses I'd built up, all the excuses I'd told myself, crumbled in the face of his honesty. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, "but you did, and it's not just this one time. It's been building for a while, Ellie, and I'm tired." He grabbed his coffee and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my chest heavy with the weight of everything I hadn't wanted to admit. I stood there in the kitchen long after Mark had left, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. His words replayed in my head, over and over, each repetition scraping at something raw inside me. "It's not about your intent. It's about how it landed." He was right. God, he was right, and that realization was like swallowing broken glass. For all my justifications, all my insistence that it was just a joke, I had never once considered what it might feel like to be on the receiving end. I thought back to all the other moments, the quips, the sarcastic remarks, the teasing jabs, and for the first time I saw them for what they were. Not playful, not harmless, but cutting. Dismissive. I sank into a chair at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the coffee cup still sitting in front of me. The room felt cold, empty, the warmth and familiarity I'd always associated with it now replaced by something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. I wanted to run after him, to say something, anything, to make this right, but I didn't even know where to begin. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, laundry, dishes, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, but my mind was elsewhere. Every corner of the house felt heavy with his absence, even when he was physically there. I'd hear him moving around upstairs or catch a glimpse of him walking through the living room, but it was like we were living in two different worlds. By the time evening came, I was emotionally exhausted. I sat on the couch, a glass of wine in my hand, staring at the TV without really watching it. Mark was in his usual spot in the armchair, his laptop open on his knees. The glow from the screen cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more tired than I remembered. I wanted to say something, to break the silence that had stretched so thick and suffocating between us, but the words caught in my throat. I kept replaying his earlier words in my head, the quiet anger in his voice, the exhaustion in his eyes. He wasn't just upset about the joke, it was everything. All the little things I'd ignored, all the moments I'd taken him for granted. The truth was, I'd been using humor as a shield for a long time. It was easier to make light of things than to confront the deeper issues simmering beneath the surface. I'd always prided myself on being quick-witted, on my ability to keep things fun and breezy, but now I wondered if I'd been hiding behind that facade. If I'd been using it as a way to avoid vulnerability, to avoid having to face the things I didn't want to admit about myself or about us. I glanced over at Mark, watching as he typed something on his laptop. The thought of losing him, of this distance becoming permanent, sent a wave of panic crashing over me. But even in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to speak. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The words I wanted to say to him tumbled through my head, but they all felt inadequate, hollow. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I understood now, that I was willing to do the work to make things better. But there was a part of me, a stubborn, prideful part, that resisted. A part of me that still wanted to believe this wasn't entirely my fault, that he bore some of the blame too. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the shower running. Mark had always been an early riser, but I used to love those quiet mornings when it was just the two of us. Now, they felt like another reminder of how far apart we'd drifted. When he came into the kitchen, I was already sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in front of me. He hesitated when he saw me, like he wasn't sure if he should sit down or keep moving. "Morning," I said, my voice soft. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his posture tense. I took a deep breath, the words sitting heavy on my tongue. "Mark," I began, "I'm sorry." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "For what?" "For what I said quickly, my voice faltering. "For hurting you. I didn't mean to, but that doesn't matter." "I see that now. I've been careless with my words, with your feelings. I didn't realize how much it affected you, and I'm sorry." He didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched between us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear of rejection, of him saying it was too little too late, gnawing at me. Finally, he sighed and set his mug down. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. "But it's not just about saying sorry, Ellie. It's about doing better. It's about not dismissing me, not making me feel small just because it's easier for you." His words hit me hard, but I nodded. "I know," I said, "and I will, I promise." For the first time in days, his expression softened just slightly. He nodded, picking up his coffee again and taking a sip. It wasn't much, but it felt like a crack in the wall we'd built between us. As he left the room, I felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a chance to find our way back to each other. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every interaction with Mark was laced with an undercurrent of caution, as though we were both afraid to misstep and send everything crashing down again. He wasn't cold, not exactly, but there was a distance in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. It was as if he'd built a wall around himself, and while he'd let me get close enough to see over it, he wasn't ready to let me in. I tried to give him space while also showing him that I was trying. I made an effort to listen more when we talked, to catch myself before saying something flippant or dismissive. But the truth was, I felt lost. I didn't know how to navigate this new version of us, where every word I said felt like it carried the weight of everything we'd left unsaid for years. One evening, about a week after our conversation in the kitchen, I decided to take a more direct approach. Mark was sitting on the couch, his laptop on his knees as he typed away at something for work. I sat down next to him, the cushion dipping slightly under my weight. He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the screen. "Do you have a minute?" I asked, my voice tentative. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before closing the laptop and setting it aside. "What's up?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, "about what you said, about how I've made you feel, and I think you're right. I've been dismissive, not just with the joke, but in other ways too. I didn't realize how much I've been taking you for granted." Mark didn't say anything right away, but the way his gaze softened slightly gave me the courage to continue. "I guess I thought. I don't know, that teasing was just part of our dynamic, that it didn't bother you because you never really said it did. But I can see now how that's not fair. Just because you didn't say anything doesn't mean it didn't hurt, and I should have known better." He let out a soft sigh, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I realized he'd been doing more often lately, as though trying to hide the thinning patches. "It's not just the teasing, Ellie," he said finally. "It's the way you make me feel like my feelings don't matter, like I'm overreacting or being sensitive if I ever try to bring something up." I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him that wasn't true, but I stopped myself. He was right. I'd done that, too, minimized his emotions because it was easier than facing the possibility that I might be wrong. "You're right," I said softly. "I've done that, and I'm sorry." Mark looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of something familiar in his eyes. "I just want to feel like we're on the same team," he said. "Like I can talk to you about how I feel without it turning into a joke or a fight. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Ellie. I just need you to try." "I am trying," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll keep trying. I don't want to lose you, Mark." He reached out then, his hand covering mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "You haven't lost me," he said. "But it's going to take time." "I know," I said, squeezing his hand gently. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small glimmer of hope. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. And maybe that was enough for now. That night, as we lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say and do to make things right. But for the first time, those thoughts weren't consumed by panic or fear. They were filled with determination. Because for all the mistakes I'd made, for all the ways I'd hurt him without realizing it, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this be the end of us. I was going to do the work, no matter how hard it was, because he was worth it. We were worth it. The days stretched on, and with them came a quiet, tentative rebuilding. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt the weight of my own impatience pressing down on me, an almost desperate urge for things to snap back to the way they were. But I knew better now. There was no going back, Only forward, and forward meant facing the uncomfortable truths I'd been avoiding for so long. One evening, about 2 weeks after our conversation on the couch, I found myself in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair and staring at my own reflection. My face looked tired, older somehow, as though the past few weeks had added years. I thought about the woman I'd been when Mark and I first met, vibrant, self-assured, confident in ways that had felt unshakable. Somewhere along the way, that version of me had begun to harden, her sharpness turning inward until it spilled out onto those closest to her. I hadn't wanted to admit it before, but the truth was staring me in the face now. I had been using Mark as an outlet for my own insecurities. The teasing, the sarcastic comments, the little jabs, they had been less about him and more about me. About my fear of vulnerability, my need to deflect, my refusal to confront the ways I felt inadequate. The realization was humbling, to say the least. That night, as we sat at the dinner table, I decided to take a leap I'd been avoiding. Mark was scrolling through his phone, absent-mindedly picking at his food, and I could feel the tension in the air between us, the kind of tension that comes from too much left unsaid. "Mark," I began, setting my fork down. He looked up, his expression wary, as though bracing for another apology or another promise to do better. But this time, I had something else in mind. "I've been thinking a lot about us," I said, my voice steady but soft. "And about me, about the things I've done not just to hurt you but to avoid dealing with my own stuff." He frowned slightly, setting his phone down. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat, but I forced myself to keep going. "I think I've been using you as a mirror for my own insecurities," I admitted. "When I make those comments about your hair or anything else, it's not because I actually feel that way about you. It's because I don't know how to deal with the things I feel about myself. It's easier to deflect, to make jokes, than to be vulnerable. But that's not fair to you." Mark's expression softened, though he didn't say anything right away. I could see him processing my words, turning them over in his mind. "I've been so scared of looking at my own flaws that I've spent years pointing out yours instead," I continued, my voice trembling slightly. "And I'm sorry for that. You don't deserve to carry that weight, and I don't want to keep doing it." For a long moment, he didn't speak. The silence was heavy, but it didn't feel like the suffocating silence of the past few weeks. It felt different, like something was shifting between us. Finally, he nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That's honest," he said quietly. "And I appreciate it, I do." I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the guardedness that hadn't been there before all of this. But I also saw a flicker of something else, something that looked a little like hope. "I'm not expecting you to forgive me overnight," I said quickly, before he could respond. "And I'm not saying this to make excuses. I need you to know that I see it now, that I see you. And I'm trying to do better, not just for you, but for me too." Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I believe you," he said after a long pause. "But you're right, it's going to take time for both of us." His words were cautious, measured, but they didn't sting the way I thought they might. Instead, they felt like a starting point, a small but significant step forward. We cleared the table together that night, a quiet rhythm settling between us as we worked side by side. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sweeping declaration, but it was something, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were both still here, still trying. Later, as we lay in bed, I found myself reaching for his hand under the covers. He hesitated for a moment before threading his fingers through mine, and the simple warmth of his touch brought tears to my eyes. I didn't say anything, and neither did he. But in that quiet moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of connection, fragile but real. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was enough to remind me why we were worth fighting for. The weeks continued to pass, and with them came the painstaking work of rebuilding. It wasn't linear. Some days felt lighter, like we were finding our rhythm again, small moments of laughter or shared silence hinting at the connection we once had. Other days were heavier, filled with the weight of everything we'd yet to resolve. But the effort was there, on both sides, and that gave me hope. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find Mark already downstairs. The smell of coffee wafted through the house, and I followed it into the kitchen, where he stood at the counter, flipping through the paper. He looked up when I walked in, offering me a small, almost shy smile. "Morning," he said, "Morning," I replied, reaching for a mug. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it still carried a faint awkwardness, like we were both tiptoeing around unspoken words. As I poured my coffee, I decided to take a chance. "Do you want to go for a walk later? Maybe grab lunch somewhere?" Mark hesitated, his gaze flickering to the paper before returning to me. "Yeah," he said finally. "That sounds nice." It was such a simple exchange, but it felt monumental. For so long, I'd been afraid to reach out, afraid of rejection or of doing the wrong thing. But this small step, this willingness to spend time together, felt like progress. The walk was quiet at first. We strolled through the park near our house, the crisp autumn air biting at our cheeks. I noticed the way Mark's hands were shoved into his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched against the chill. He'd always had a way of carrying himself that seemed effortlessly composed, but now I wondered how much of that had been a facade, how much he'd been holding back all these years. As we walked, I found myself speaking without fully thinking it through. "Do you ever feel like we just stopped paying attention to each other?" Mark glanced at me, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "Like when we first started dating, I noticed everything about you. The way you smiled, the way you talked about things you cared about. But somewhere along the line, I stopped noticing. Or maybe I just stopped looking." He was quiet for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think that happens to a lot of people. You get comfortable and you stop trying as hard. You assume the other person will just always be there." His words stung, but only because they rang so true. I'd spent so much time focused on my own feelings, my own insecurities, that I hadn't noticed how much he'd been carrying, how much effort he'd been putting in even as I'd been pulling away. "I don't want to do that anymore," I said quietly. "I want to notice again. I want to see you." Mark stopped walking, turning to face me. His expression was hard to read, somewhere between cautious and hopeful. "I want that too," he said. It wasn't a declaration, not exactly, but it felt like one. Over lunch, we talked about lighter things. The show we'd been watching, a funny story from his work, my half-hearted attempt to try yoga the week before. It felt easy in a way that I hadn't expected, like we were rediscovering parts of each other that had been buried under years of routine and familiarity. That evening, as we sat on the couch together, Mark surprised me by bringing up something I hadn't dared to ask about since this all began. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice measured. "What part?" I asked, my stomach tightening slightly. "About your insecurities. About how you use humor to deflect," he said. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I've done that too in my own way, not with humor but with shutting down, with pulling away." His admission caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rising in my throat. "Mark, no, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not saying that to excuse anything. I'm saying it because I think we both need to work on this, on being honest with each other and with ourselves." I nodded, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. "You're right," I said. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, like the fog that had been clouding my thoughts was beginning to lift. We weren't fixed, not yet, maybe not ever, but we were moving forward. Together. As the night wore on, we stayed on the couch, talking about things we hadn't talked about in years, our dreams, our fears, the things that had drawn us to each other in the first place. It felt like peeling back layers, revealing parts of ourselves we'd forgotten how to share. When we finally went to bed, I reached for Mark's hand under the covers, and this time he didn't hesitate. His fingers entwined with mine, warm and steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that we were going to be okay. The weeks turned into months, and while things weren't perfect, they were different, better, in small but significant ways. Mark and I were talking more, really talking, and not just about surface-level things like what to have for dinner or whose turn it was to take out the trash. We were digging deeper, into the parts of ourselves we'd let grow distant. It was hard, uncomfortable at times, but it felt necessary. One evening, as we sat on the porch together, bundled up against the chill, Mark turned to me with a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you ever think about why we started making fun of each other?" he asked, his voice quiet. I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it wasn't always like this," he said, his gaze distant. "When we first started dating, we didn't pick at each other like that. We laughed, sure, but it was never mean. At least it didn't feel that way. I thought back to those early days, the way we used to tease each other in a way that felt light and playful, like a private joke only we understood. Somewhere along the way, that playfulness had twisted into something sharper, more biting. I think it started when things got harder, I admitted. When life got more stressful, work, money, family stuff, it was easier to make jokes than to deal with the real issues. Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I guess I let it happen too. I didn't push back because it felt like, I don't know, a way to keep things from getting too serious. Like if we didn't talk about the hard stuff, it couldn't hurt us. But it did, I said softly. He glanced at me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, it did. There was a long silence as we sat there, the sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking, kids laughing in the distance, filling the space between us. Finally, Mark spoke again. I don't want us to be like that anymore, he said. I don't want to keep avoiding things just because they're hard. Me neither, I said, my voice firm, and I meant it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same page, like we were both willing to do the work to make this relationship something stronger, something healthier. Over time, we started building new habits. We made an effort to compliment each other more, to express gratitude for the little things. When I felt the urge to make a sarcastic comment or a snide remark, I paused and asked myself why. Was it really necessary? Was it coming from a place of love, or was it a defense mechanism? Mark was doing the same. I noticed how he'd started to open up more, sharing his feelings instead of retreating into silence. It wasn't always easy for him. I could see the effort it took. But every time he did, it felt like another brick removed from the wall that had grown between us. One night, as we lay in bed, I turned to him and said something I hadn't said in a long time. I'm proud of you. He looked at me, surprised. For what? For trying, I said. For opening up even when it's hard. I see how much effort you're putting in, and it means a lot to me. Mark didn't say anything right away, but the way his hand found mine under the covers told me everything I needed to know. As the weeks went on, I started to notice something else, too. The more we worked on our relationship, the more I began to see myself differently. I wasn't just Mark's wife or someone's co-worker or friend. I was a woman who was learning to face her own flaws, her own fears, and take responsibility for them. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't immediately pick myself apart. I saw someone who was trying, who was growing, who was learning how to love not just Mark, but herself. It wasn't perfect. We still had our moments, an argument here, a misstep there, but they didn't feel like the end of the world anymore. They felt like opportunities to learn, to grow, to understand each other better. And in those moments, I realized something important. Love wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about never making mistakes or never hurting each other. It was about choosing each other, day after day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Mark turned to me and said something I'll never forget. You know, I used to think we'd lost what we had, he said. But now I think we're building something better. I smiled, tears welling up in my eyes. I think so too. And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay, not because we'd fixed everything, but because we were willing to keep trying. Because we were choosing each other every single day. A few months later, I found myself sitting alone in the living room one evening. Mark had gone to bed early after a long day at work, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stared out the window, watching the branches sway in the wind, and allowed myself a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. It felt like a lifetime ago that I'd made that stupid comment about his hairline. What had started as a careless, offhand remark had spiraled into something far more profound, forcing both of us to confront the cracks in our relationship that we'd been ignoring for years. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything, but now I could see it for what it really was, a beginning. I thought about the way Mark had looked at me earlier that evening when I'd handed him a cup of tea without him asking. It was such a small gesture, but his smile had been warm, genuine, and full of gratitude. Moments like that had become more frequent lately, little reminders that we were finding our way back to each other, one step at a time. But it wasn't just about Mark anymore. In the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I was beginning to see myself differently too. For so long, I defined myself by my relationship with him, by the roles I played as a wife, a partner, a source of humor or support. I'd buried my own insecurities under layers of deflection and sarcasm, too afraid to face them head-on. Now, I was learning how to sit with those feelings, to acknowledge them without letting them control me. I'd started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. At first, it had felt awkward, like I didn't know how to talk to myself anymore. But over time, the words had started to flow, and with them came a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Writing gave me a space to process everything, my fears, my hopes, my regrets, and it helped me see patterns in my behavior that I might have missed otherwise. One entry, in particular, stood out to me. I'd written it a few weeks after that first difficult conversation with Mark, and reading it now, it felt like looking at a different version of myself. I don't know if I deserve his forgiveness. I don't know if I deserve my own, but I'm starting to understand that deserving isn't the point. It's about trying. It's about showing up, even when it's messy and imperfect. It's about learning how to love, not just him, but myself too. Maybe that's what I've been missing all along. I closed the journal and leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I wrote those words, but they still rang true. Trying was what mattered. Showing up was what mattered. And I was doing both, even when it wasn't easy. The next morning, as Mark and I sat at the kitchen table sipping our coffee, I decided to share something with him that I'd been keeping to myself. "I've been journaling again," I said, watching his reaction carefully. He looked up from his mug, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, how's that been?" "Good, I think," I said. "It's helped me process a lot of things about us, about myself. I feel like I'm starting to understand why I've been the way I've been, you know?" Mark nodded slowly, setting his coffee down. "That's really good," he said. "I'm proud of you for doing that." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. "Thanks," I said softly. "It's been eye-opening, and I think it's made me a better partner, or at least I hope it has." "You have," he said without hesitation. "I can see the effort you're putting in, and it means a lot to me." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The weight of his words settled over me, warm and reassuring, and I felt a sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. "You mean a lot to me, too," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. We didn't need to say anything else. The understanding between us was enough. As the day went on, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come. There was still work to do. There always would be. But we were in it together now, and that made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we weren't just surviving. We were growing, both as individuals and as a couple. That evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I rested my head on Mark's shoulder and allowed myself to simply exist in the moment. His arm draped around me, his presence steady and comforting, and I felt a quiet kind of happiness that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for certain. We were stronger now, not because we'd avoided the hard things, but because we'd faced them together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Not just for us, but for myself too.